Vikings, terrifying Norse warriors, have dominated our imagination for over a millennium. Dragon-prowed longships cutting through fog-shrouded waters, battle-hardened raiders descending on unsuspecting monasteries, their very name becoming synonymous with maritime terror. But here's where our neat historical narrative hits a snag, one that most people never hear about. Even the Vikings had waters they dared not enter. In the eastern Baltic, something darker lurked. Meet the Curonians, the sea raiders that history somehow forgot to mention in the same breath as Vikings, despite striking fear into Norse hearts for centuries. These weren't some minor coastal tribes scraping by on fishing and petty theft. The Curonians controlled the Courland Peninsula, a strategic stretch of Baltic coastline covering what we now call Western Latvia and parts of Lithuania. From their base along this windswept shore, they commanded one of the most lucrative and dangerous positions in medieval Europe, the intersection of major trade routes between Scandinavia, Russia, and the Germanic territories. But calling them simple pirates would be like calling a wolf just another dog. The Curonians had evolved into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. They operated a maritime empire built on three pillars: raiding, trading, and slave-taking. And they'd perfected all three to a degree that made even Viking chieftains take notice. What made the Curonians particularly unsettling was their dual nature. One day, they might engage in perfectly legitimate trade negotiations with Swedish merchants, exchanging amber and furs for silver and iron. The next day, those same merchants might find themselves fleeing Curonian war parties, bent on capturing them for the slave markets of Kiev or Constantinople. This unpredictability created a psychological weapon almost as powerful as their actual ships and spears. The Curonians understood something that many other Baltic peoples missed. The sea wasn't just a highway for trade, it was a hunting ground. While other groups focused on defending their territories or establishing permanent settlements, the Curonians perfected the art of maritime predation. They turned the Baltic's complex geography of islands, shoals, and hidden channels into their personal maze, where they could appear and disappear at will. Unlike the agricultural communities that dotted most of the Baltic coast, Curonian settlements were essentially naval bases. Every able-bodied man was expected to serve on the ships. Their children grew up learning to read currents and winds before they could properly read runes. Their women often managed the complex logistics of outfitting expeditions and processing the wealth that flowed back from successful raids. And warfare was not merely a means of acquiring glory or settling disputes. It was a business. Curonian raids were carefully planned operations with specific objectives, detailed intelligence gathering, and sophisticated risk assessment. They studied their targets, learned their weaknesses, and struck with surgical precision. This wasn't the berserker fury of Viking warfare. This was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective. The Vikings, despite all their maritime prowess, had never encountered anything quite like this. Norse raiders were accustomed to inspiring fear, not feeling it. They were used to being the wolves, not the sheep. But in the labyrinthine waters of the eastern Baltic, the Curonians had created conditions where even the most experienced Viking crews found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and very much out of their depth. The secret to Curonian dominance lay in a single, devastating advantage. They had engineered their entire naval strategy around the Baltic's most treacherous characteristic, its deceptively shallow waters. While Viking longships were marvels of engineering designed for deep-water ocean crossings and river navigation, they had a fatal flaw in Baltic coastal warfare. These vessels, typically drawing 2 to 3 feet of water when fully loaded, were simply too deep for the intricate shallow water combat that defined eastern Baltic conflicts. The Curonians, however, had spent generations perfecting vessels that could operate in water barely knee-deep. Their ships, which archaeologists believe were precursors to the later cog design, featured revolutionary shallow draft hulls that could navigate in as little as 18 inches of water. This wasn't just a minor technical advantage, it was a complete game changer. Imagine being a Viking raider, confident in your superior seamanship, only to watch enemy vessels seemingly glide across waters where your own ships would run aground within minutes. But the Curonians didn't stop at ship design. They had transformed the Baltic's geography itself into a weapon system. The eastern Baltic coast is a maze of over 2,000 islands, countless hidden reefs, and shifting sandbars that can trap unwary vessels for days. What looked like navigational nightmares to outsiders were highways to the Curonians. They had mapped every channel, memorized every tide pattern, and could navigate these waters in conditions that would terrify even experienced Norse pilots. Consider the tactical implications. A Viking raiding fleet approaching Curonian territory would find themselves forced into predictable deep water channels, essentially announcing their arrival hours in advance. Meanwhile, Curonian scout vessels could shadow them from parallel shallow channels, completely invisible to their targets. When the moment came to strike, Curonian ships could attack from directions that seemed impossible, emerging from waters the Vikings considered unnavigable. Their intimate knowledge of local weather patterns provided another crucial edge. The Baltic's notorious sudden storms, which could transform calm seas into ship-killing tempests within hours, were less random to those who understood the signs. Curonian navigators could read wind shifts, cloud formations, and wave patterns with supernatural precision. They would deliberately time their attacks for moments when approaching weather would trap enemy fleets in exposed positions. Even more unsettling was their mastery of seasonal warfare. The Baltic's extreme seasonal variations, from summer's endless daylight to winter's months of darkness, created opportunities that the Curonians exploited ruthlessly. Winter raids were particularly terrifying, as Curonian warriors could use the cover of polar night to approach completely undetected, striking sleeping settlements with devastating effectiveness. Their weapons technology reflected this specialized approach to coastal warfare. While Vikings favored axes and swords designed for close combat on ship decks, Curonians developed spears and javelins optimized for fighting in shallow water and marshy terrain. They perfected the use of crossbows, relatively rare in Scandinavia, but devastatingly effective for picking off enemies from concealed positions among the reeds and islands. The morning of August 15th, 1187, should have been just another successful Viking raid. A Danish fleet under King Canute VI had swept into the Baltic, targeting what they assumed would be easy pickings along the Curonian coast. These weren't inexperienced raiders. Many had participated in successful expeditions to England and Ireland. They knew their business. By evening, the survivors would be rowing desperately back toward Danish waters, their fleet decimated and their king barely escaping with his life. The attack began like so many others. The Danish ships had positioned themselves offshore at dawn, preparing to launch their assault on a Curonian settlement. But as they moved into attack formation, something went wrong. Ships that had been sailing in deep water suddenly found themselves scraping bottom on hidden sandbars. The Curonians had somehow manipulated the very seabed, using their knowledge of shifting sands to create underwater traps. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a systematic destruction. Curonian vessels materialized from channels the Danes hadn't even noticed, attacking the immobilized ships from impossible angles. Danish warriors, trained for conventional ship-to-ship combat, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage on familiar terms. Instead of the expected boarding actions and axe battles, they faced a rain of crossbow bolts from concealed positions and coordinated ramming attacks from vessels that seemed to dance across the water. But the Curonians weren't interested in simply sinking Danish ships. They were capturing them. More specifically, they were capturing the crews alive. For Vikings, who expected to die gloriously in battle, the prospect of being taken alive was far worse than death. It meant slavery, ransom, or ritual sacrifice, fates that stripped them of dignity and denied them any form of warrior's end. The psychological impact of this defeat rippled throughout Scandinavia. Suddenly, Baltic expeditions were no longer guaranteed profit ventures. Swedish and Danish kings found themselves having to offer significantly higher rewards to recruit crews willing to risk Curonian waters. Some experienced raiders simply refused to sail east of Gotland, considering it too dangerous, regardless of potential rewards. The Curonians had achieved something remarkable. They had made the Vikings afraid of the sea. This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical records, though frustratingly sparse, contain references to multiple Viking defeats in Curonian waters. The 1198 expedition that resulted in the capture of several prominent Norwegian jarls. The devastating ambush of 1203 that wiped out an entire Swedish raiding fleet near modern-day Liepāja. The mysterious disappearance of Olaf Tryggvason's advance scouts in 999, which some historians believe was orchestrated by Curonian intelligence networks. Each defeat followed a similar pattern. Confident Viking forces entering what they assumed were familiar waters, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to control the very elements. The Curonians had turned the Baltic into their personal arena, where superior seamanship, local knowledge, and tactical innovation could overcome traditional Viking advantages in weapons and warrior culture. Perhaps most unsettling of all was how the Curonians treated their victories. Unlike Vikings, who celebrated their conquests in elaborate sagas and boastful poems, the Curonians remained mysteriously quiet about their successes. This silence was itself a weapon. Vikings never knew when or where the next attack might come, creating a persistent anxiety that followed Norse expeditions throughout the eastern Baltic. What truly set the Curonians apart wasn't just their ability to defeat Vikings in battle. It was what they did with their captives afterward. While most medieval warriors viewed prisoners as either ransom opportunities or additional mouths to feed, the Curonians had developed an industrial-scale slave trading operation that stretched from the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. The numbers alone tell a chilling story. Historical records suggest that during the height of their power, Curonian slave markets processed thousands of captives annually. But these weren't random raids for human cargo. This was a precisely orchestrated business model that targeted specific types of prisoners based on market demand hundreds of miles away. Vikings, with their reputation as fierce warriors and skilled craftsmen, commanded premium prices in the slave markets of Kiev, Constantinople, and Cairo. A captured Viking jarl could be worth more than an entire season's worth of traditional raids. This economic reality transformed every Viking expedition into a potential treasure hunt for Curonian raiders. They weren't just fighting to defend their territory, they were actively hunting some of the most valuable human commodities in medieval Europe. The Curonians had perfected a capture and processing system that would have impressed Roman slavers. Temporary holding facilities dotted the Courland coast, designed to keep large numbers of prisoners alive and healthy during the sorting process. The most valuable captives, nobles, skilled craftsmen, and young warriors were separated for long-distance transport to premium markets. Others were sold locally or put to work in Curonian settlements. But here's what made this particularly psychological warfare. The Curonians deliberately publicized the fates of their high-profile captives. Word would filter back to Scandinavia about prominent Vikings spotted in slave markets from Novgorod to Baghdad. A Danish noble captured in 1195 was reportedly seen years later serving as a galley slave on Byzantine ships. Swedish warriors taken in coastal raids appeared in the retinues of wealthy Arab merchants. This wasn't just about the economic value of slaves, it was psychological warfare. The prospect of ending up in chains thousands of miles from home, serving foreign masters who didn't even speak their language, was a fate that shattered Viking pride. The Curonians even developed specialized capture techniques designed to take prisoners alive rather than kill them outright. They used nets, weighted ropes, and coordinated grappling tactics that focused on disabling rather than destroying enemy crews. Their ships carried extra provisions specifically for transporting captives, and their raiders trained extensively in non-lethal combat methods. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained detailed records of their captives, essentially inventory management for human cargo. Bone artifacts found in Curonian settlements include what appear to be tally markers, possibly used to track prisoners by origin, condition, and market value. This level of organization indicates a slave trade operation that rivaled anything seen in medieval Europe. The psychological impact extended beyond individual captives. Viking communities lived in constant fear that their men might not just die in battle, but disappear entirely into the vast slave networks that stretched across Eurasia. Families had no way of knowing whether missing warriors were dead or suffering in bondage thousands of miles away. This uncertainty created a unique form of trauma that traditional Viking culture was unprepared to handle. Here's one of history's most revealing silences: the Viking sagas, those epic tales glorifying Norse victories and heroic deaths, barely mention the Curonians. For a culture obsessed with martial glory, that absence speaks volumes. Viking sagas weren't objective records. They were cultural propaganda reinforcing Norse identity. Glorious deaths, always included, but defeats at the hands of Baltic tribes, quietly erased. Other enemies like Anglo-Saxons or Franks appear even in defeat, so long as it looked heroic. But the Curonians offered no such narrative. Vikings captured, outmaneuvered, or enslaved didn't fit the mold. The few mentions, troubles in eastern waters, are vague, as if the truth was too painful to record. Practical reasons played a role too. Viking raids were funded ventures. Admitting crushing losses in Curonian waters risked future investments. Silence became strategy. It went deeper than pride. Viking society was built on the myth of martial superiority. Their economy, religion, and social order all depended on it. Acknowledging repeated defeats would unravel the foundation. But cracks emerged during the Northern Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries. Christian chroniclers now had reason to detail Curonian resistance, framing them as pagans to be conquered. These accounts, ironically, revealed just how advanced Curonian warfare had become. Crusading armies with superior tech still struggled for decades to break their defenses. Even then, Viking-era losses remained buried. It was easier to reframe the conflict as a righteous crusade than admit Scandinavia's greatest warriors had once feared these Baltic raiders. But the Curonians weren't the only ones who made the Vikings hesitate. Further north, a forgotten tribe turned the tables on the Norse, using tactics so terrifying the sagas barely dared to mention them.